Claire and Richard got married in the year 2000, and it has been 10 years of togetherness now. Mealy and Jock have been college sweethearts, and over the years they built a strong foundation of love that included so many promise, laughter, and dreams. Richard, a marketing executive, was the kind of husband who could have made any women who knew them happy. Other women whom he knew include Claire, who was a school teacher and who in fact used to be in love with him. Oh, they constructed a life that appeared enviable to others. A warm home, friendship, and a mother-in-law, Margaret, an aging widow, who's free to visit her daughter as often as she wants. Margaret was a widowed woman who had lost her husband a decade ago and remained all alone in her home except her only daughter named Claire. She is an important woman in their lives, and she was visiting them quite often. That made her a rather permanent fixture in Claire and Richard's existence. The woman was pretty and social. People were immediately attracted to Margaret. Still, at times, Claire had an impression that something was between her mother and Richard. She dismissed it as her tendency to exaggerate things in her head. Richard and her mother were on good terms, and that was a positive thing. However, Claire really could not help but to feel that there is something queer about the entire picture. It started with the tiny things, such as how Margaret brushed her hand on his arm, private jokes that they shared, or the way Richard appeared to come alive whenever Margaret was nearby. Claire just shrugged it off, saying to herself that she is just being over-observant. Indeed, what business could Richard, her loving husband, have to have any dealings with her own mother? Little by little, there were signs that Claire couldn't help but see over the course of months. Richard started arriving home late from work, saying he was held back by some clients or the deadlines he had to meet at work. On some of these days, Margaret would come over to help in keeping Claire company on those lonely nights while sipping a glass of what and flashing lovely smile. Still, Claire could see that on these she was getting more messages, and looked at her phone with a silly smile on her lips. In elaborating this, Margaret would shrug her shoulders and say, "Oh, it is just an old friend." Claire just thought it was normal, but one fine day everything she had built came crumbling down in front of her. Claire just thought it was normal, but one fine day everything she had built came crumbling down in front of her. This episode was on a Saturday morning, and the day when Claire opted to clean the house while Richard was away. As she tidied up the bedroom, she found something that stopped her cold. A scarf made from material as soft as silk, and in color red, which is delicately embroidered. It wasn't hers. Claire was sure it belonged to her mother. She had noticed that Margaret had same scarf a number of times. The shock affected Claire in such a way that it really struck her. Their mother's scarf, however, was found in their bedroom, and this prompted a question as to how it got there. She tried to find words to say something in defense. Perhaps Margaret had dropped it when coming to pay her visit one day. But when Claire was standing there with the scarf in her hand, images that she had buried deep into her heart started coming back. The way Richard and Margaret talked to each other. The text at 1 a.m. clearly shared interest and attraction. She quivered and seemed to have come to the realization of the fact she had been trying to escape for long. Who could have imagined such a scenario, let alone think that a man, her husband, was cheating on her with her own mother? The revelation, and the fact that Peter betrayed everyone and Cliff was a killer, left Claire dazed and confused. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She felt as though she has been betrayed by Richard and her own mother, who she trusted most as she grew up. They'd betrayed her so cruelly, and in a way that was so much more intimate that she felt sick. All had been heartbroken, because the people she loved most in this world have left her, and even took her money, right from under her. So the following days for Claire again were kind of a blur. She didn't challenge Richard to it immediately, but she only watched him, her spirit overwhelmed with the bitter fact that had knocked at the door of her life. She sat and waited for him to come home as usual at late hours of the night. He was still repeating the same stories for the past few months, while his face was a picture of indifference. Claire wanted to scream. She wanted to cry. She even wanted to demand answers, but the size of such truth overwhelmed her. and Claire kept all those emotions to herself. Last of all, it arrived one evening, as Margaret invited Claire at her house for dinner. Richard, giving some lame excuses that he has to be at work, told them that he would get there later. Claire nodded, and though she couldn't achieve the same excited vigor that Joe exuberated, she was certainly excited. She felt that it was high time she came out of the closet and stopped holding her peace. As she got to Margaret's home, her mother welcomed her with a smile and took her to the living room to offer her a glass of wine. But Claire accepted it, and through all her attempts at friendship with Margaret, she could not help but feel disgust and sorrow whenever she looked at her. In what ways had her mother, the woman who had raised her, who had been her most intimate friend, become associated with such a thing? They went to eat, but Claire could not wait any longer. They began making out. She put her fork on the plate and stared at Margaret, narrowing her eyes in anger. "I searched for this a long time, and guess what?" Claire asked coldly, her eyes glaring at me, fixed on the scarf on the table. "In my bedroom." The words clouded exactly over Margaret's lips that revealed the first emotion, the flare of terror with the blanching of her face. "What are you talking about?" she asked nervously, trying to contain her fear against the unknown. "Of course I do," Claire snapped back at her. "You know very well what I am talking about." Claire rather pointedly. "You think I'm an idiot, don't you, Mom? I see perfectly how things are between you and Mr. Richard." They looked at one another for minutes. The silence was a long, cumbersome, and uncomfortable one. The look that Claire gave her was one that made Margaret put her wine glass down carefully and avoid looking into her eyes. In a way, Claire seemed to think her mother would deny it, but before she could, Margaret took a deep breath. She looked defeated, as if something that has been weighing her down had been lifted off of her. "I never intended to cause you pain, Claire," Margaret said gently, placing a hand on her lips. "It just unfolded. Richard and we weren't expecting it to get this far." Claire's stomach churned. It was something that left him breathless, hearing his wife confess about the affair. "You didn't plan it getting to such an extent?" Claire asked, and her tone turned shrill. "How did you allow it at all? How could you betray me like this? You are my mother. No one could misbehave like that for a mother, especially when using a gun that belongs to her." Guilt shone in Margaret's eyes, and she teared up, while Claire had no pity in her heart. She was too hurt, too angry. She was too embarrassed. But Margaret pleaded that it is not what you think. It is not what you imagine it is. Richard and we just clicked in a way that, words fail me, Claire, it was not about you. For me, it was a relation where the two lovers simply could not cease. Heads up. Claire was fed up with her mother and decided to stand from the table without listening to the long excuses. "Not about me," she screamed out loud. "I slept with my husband, and it has nothing to do with you? Do you even realize how dare you are right now?" Margaret winced at what Claire just said to her, and Claire didn't bother to care. Her world was fallen, and no amount of apologies could ever bring back what she has lost. "I trusted you," Claire repeated, gesturing toward herself shrilly. "Both of you." And that, Claire walked out the door and left the house in anger and tears and unfathomable pain and confusion. She had no idea where to turn or where to go, or even what to do, but she could not remain where she was any longer. She continued driving round the town hysterically and full of tears. Her heart was breaking each minute. When she got home, Richard was sitting on the couch looking pale and uneasy. At the same time, he was happy to see her. Claire interrupted him abruptly. There wasn't any chance for him to add more to the conversation. She threw the scarf at him, becoming extremely angry and upset. "You and my beloved mother?" she yelled at me. "How could you?" Richard looked guilty. He stood up when she turned towards him. His eyes were opened wide. "No, Ben, I want you to stay put," she ordered. Not waiting for him to open his mouth, she continued. "Claire, I can explain." "No," she said firmly. "You don't need to make excuses to me," I said angrily. "I need the truth." The corners of Richard's lips turned down, and he slumped his shoulders and his eyes shifted to avoid seeing her. "No," he murmured. "It was not calculated. I didn't mean to make you unhappy, Claire. It just happened to her. You know, your mom and I got closer, and I could not avoid it." Once more, Claire's heart was broken to pieces. "You got close?" That was what she exclaimed in a bitter tone. That is intolerable, Richard. You've been sleeping with my mother, you total pervert. I know, Richard whispered, and there was a sadness in the depth of his voice. I know I have failed you in some way. I love you, Claire. I never stopped loving you. Claire let out a harsh trail of laughter, which ended with her shaking her head in disbelief. Love? You call this love? That was the most heinous thing that you can do to me, which is to betray me. What am I to do winning the loan? Am I supposed to believe anything you say after the... Then, as if wanting to have a hold on her, Richard reached out for her. Claire pushed him away, and the hatred she had was evident. Stop it, she screeched and rolled away from his hand. Don't you dare touch me. You're so disgusting, I can't even look at you right now. They looked at each other for a few seconds, having the truth of the betrayal sink in. Claire's thoughts were running wild in her mind. What life they have had, how she did once love Richard, and all those words she had said in court. But now, everything that we had experienced seemed to be so far away from what had occurred, and it dawned on me. I'm leaving. He finally spoke, and her words were shaking. She was rather determined. I can't stay here, the place where we live. I can't be with you. The vulgar emotions that Claire felt when she saw Richard's face transform and crumple did not trouble her. She was done. She had wanted to trust the two most of all people in the world, and never was she ready to look for a way to trust again. Without another word, Claire picked up a bag and walked out the front door, and she was feeling so sorrowfully betrayed. She was unsure of where she was steering herself or where life was taking her. But she made one thing clear, and that was, she was through with Richard and Margaret. They had betrayed her in a manner that cannot be undone, and so all Claire could do was to start over and slowly piece her life back together. In the weeks that followed, Claire sought therapy and stayed with close friends. Years later, she divorced Richard and never answered the phone calls and letters Margaret had sent her in an attempt to reconcile. But Claire understood very well that an apology would not erase the mistakes that were made. Gave her time to find herself, to get over the betrayal that had become her life. It was a great challenge, but after some time, Claire started to mend her broken life. She immersed herself into work, lived her own life, and over time, she began to get her share of tranquility. Hurt of betrayal did not go away, but over the years, Claire finally opened her eyes to the fact that no one was invincible, but she was as strong as she could get. She had lost the most unimaginable things, and now she wants to live a life of freedom from the coils of lies and betrayal that enslaved her.